Okay, so this afternoon, this first segment, we're going to be discussing the theme of the people, demands for purified popular sovereignty, and the challenge of exclusionary majoritarianism in modern democracies. And we're going to follow the same format, so there'll be 5-minute presentations from my colleagues here on the left, and then they may answer each other after they've done their presentations, and then the rest of the panelists here will also be able to join in the conversation, and I think we'll also be inviting you to ask some questions after that, and there are mics right here for that, but I'll let you know when that's the time for that. I was also asked to let you all know that there are books for sale over there, so please do. Hope you all brought your credit cards and your Christmas lists with. Okay.
Okay, well, it's really a pleasure to be here. Particularly, I'm a professor at the New School, and the New School was founded by people that were not only victims of fascism, but also quite anti-fascist themselves, which in a way begs the question of what is the relationship between the founding of the New School and the topic at hand, which is, I guess, the future of democracy. And I'm a specialist in the enemies of democracies, which were also the enemies of the people that founded the New School. Basically, I have dedicated, my academic life, the last 20 years or so, to study fascism and populism. So I don't belong to the new group of colleagues that are starting to deal with these issues as we speak, or because of Donald Trump. In fact, I was finishing my book, which is not being sold over there, but I can give you a discount. Actually, no, I cannot give you a discount, but I was finishing this book, which is called From Fascism to Populism in History. It was almost finished. And my editor at California Press said, why don't you wait a little bit until the elections to actually wrap it? And in fact, already I was using Trump as an example. And even, I had to confess, in that draft, there was even a horrible sentence now, for me at least, which said in his failed bid for the presidency, Donald Trump, blah 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 blah. So after it took me some days to recover as a person living in this country from the victory of Donald Trump, I realized that not only that posed a problem in many ways, but more specifically for my book. So I asked a couple of months, and I rewrote the book in light of what had happened. Now, what had happened is quite novel in the history of the world, which is that populism came to power in the most powerful country in the world. And being an expert on actually the few populisms that had been in power before Donald Trump, because there is a lot of talk about populism, but a fact that sometimes is not really talked about is the fact that there are not many examples of populist regimes. There are many examples of populism in the opposition, which is, in a way, half the cup or half the glass. I mean, not only we should study, and now I will argue, what they say when they can say things, but also what they do. And as historians, and I'm one of them, I always thought that it's important then to study the history of what populists did in power. Europe didn't help much. It didn't have a large history of populism in power as my country, Argentina, had, or my region, Latin America, had. So which is, in a way, it's not that I'm saying that people should pay attention to Latin America because I'm from Latin America, although I would like to say that. But actually, people should pay attention to the history of Latin America because you are looking very much like us, either you like it or not. And in that sense, my work and my book, and I will take probably 2 more minutes because probably I'm already, lagging behind. I'm okay. So with the disclaimer, of course, that whatever is missing from my talk is here in my book. Basically, my argument says that there is too much talk about theories of populism without actually studying what populism did and does. And in order to, it's not that we are going to provide as historians an answer to whatever is going to happen with this populist regime and the caudillo in the White House, but rather that we can provide a frame of reference for perhaps thinking of possibilities, let's say. So these are, basically the arguments. And the other argument I would like to make, because I already feel the passing of time, is that there is a lot of discussion about whether we are living under fascism in America right now. And being an historian of fascism, and actually being also, as a child, having lived in a dictatorship in dirty war Argentina, I can definitely tell you that this is not a context of dictatorship, and this is not fascism. I mean, and I think most historians of fascism agree with me on this one. And yet, I don't think people are that wrong. Whether they are philosophers or not is not really my cup of tea, but to say. But people actually, or many people, are not wrong in somehow thinking that there is some relationship here between what's going on and fascism. But in a way, that is the history of populism. Populism as a power regime emerged first in Latin America as a kind of reconceptualization, a kind of coming to grips with the issue that fascism was gone as a third way, as a third position between capitalism and socialism, or to put it differently, between liberalism and Marxism. Fascism was gone, and yet there were some fascists like General Perón in Argentina that actually tried to, in a way, rescue some remnants of fascism. And in that effort at rescuing something which they really like, he was a dictator, they decided to do the opposite of what the fascists did. You might remember that in the most famous cases of fascism, Germany and Italy, they actually used democracy to destroy democracy from within. They actually came to power and established a dictatorship from within what was before them a democracy. Perón did the opposite. He was a dictator that recognized that the war after 1945 was totally a different context. I mean, a bipolar world and not a tripolar world in which fascism had no say. And basically, he self-destroyed his own dictatorship and decided to call for elections, and he became the elected president of Argentina. Anti-politics was central. Actually, he competed against all political parties in Argentina, the communists, the conservatives, the liberals, all of them. They formed this kind of popular front against Peronism, and they lost. He won with 51%, and he understood that, of course, as a democratic mandate to rule in the name of the people, as if only the 51% that voted for him, or 52, whatever the numbers, I'm not good with numbers, were the people as a whole. And in a way, this is the first time, and Brazil soon followed with Vargas, another dictator that also wanted to be elected because he wanted the legitimacy that democracy provided. And these were the first instances in which you had democracies which rejected liberalism, and yet they kept some procedures which allowed them to call them democracies. Now, some people, and the first, perhaps I will finish with this, the first big, the first student and researcher on populism, which was the Italian Gino Germani, poor Gino Germani. He was an Italian anti-fascist who, after being in Mussolini's prison, escaped to Argentina to find himself soon afterwards with Peronism. And first he said, these are the fascists. And then he was a really smart guy. He started studying this. And he understood that although there were many connections with fascism, this was something that it was entirely new. And I will finish with this thought then, that we know that there are many calls for presenting the current situation as totally new. We are living a new era, which with his characteristic immodesty, President Trump called the age of Trump. And yet, I mean, I argue in my book that in a way this is the last chapter of a very long history of attacks against constitutional democracy. So I will finish with that.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? There we go. All right. Our country. Our people. Not you, us. I'm not going to talk about the philosophical foundations of majoritarianism, but instead about the borders in people's heads. Last panel, we talked about the borders along which you can build a wall. I want to talk about what Germans call die Mauer im Kopf, or the border in the head, and how they get there. In the Russian language, this division is between ours, наши, свои, and all others, чужие. I mention this because I am not a specialist in American politics, or in antiquity, or in political theory. I study Eastern Europe. I spent the last 30 years learning about how people in Ukraine and Hungary, in Russia, think about politics. And when I'm there, I spend most of my time thinking, talking and working alongside people who live in rural areas. Almost none of the people that I talk with in those places would describe themselves as liberals. And still, I feel confident in saying that many of them might join me in telling you that if we think the current condition is the result of a failure of liberal democracy as a philosophy, we are missing the point. If we want to think about solutions, we first need to think about correctly understanding and diagnosing the nature of the challenge, and I'm not certain that we do. Not all of the leaders we're talking about are genuine populists. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how I think leaders have attempted to redraw the boundaries of communities in countries other than the United States, countries where so-called populists have been, let's say, more competent and more successful, and are therefore further along in their trajectory than those on this side of the Atlantic, in the Northern Hemisphere. So some leaders in Eastern Europe seem to have succeeded, at least for now, in dividing people into those who are loyal and feel included and those who are not and do not feel included when leaders or constitutions refer to we the people. Now, while these so-called populists invoke ethnic identity and immigration status, and while the politics of belonging are consequential, there is also an important material story here. Important aspects of their majoritarianism are not bound up in ethnic identity or relationship to place. To understand the sources of populist exclusion in Russia and Eastern Europe, we need to talk about how elections are conducted and what people think they're doing when they're voting. Now, most of us in this room see elections as a choice, but in the places that I'm talking about, a lot of people, especially people who live outside of capital cities and are not employed in high revenue jobs, have come over time to understand elections not as a choice, but as a civic obligation and an occasion to express loyalty. Now, this might remind us of the Soviet Union, for example, but this is not how people understood elections in those places in the 1990s, and there was a change, and a change that we could observe while it was happening. So for them, elections have come to mean an opportunity to participate in a transaction. The payoff for voting or for going out onto a public square to demonstrate in support of the government is a mitigation of economic risk. And this mitigation occurs in a context characterized by enclosure, dispossession, erosion of social safety nets. So evoking many of the themes that were discussed in some of the earlier panels. So if you support the leader, you get to keep your government job. If you support the leader, your business doesn't get audited or shut down. If you support the leader, your kid keeps his place in kindergarten, your university professor gives you a passing grade, your village gets a gas line. In other words, lots of people vote for the party of power to be able to keep themselves from sinking further. Now, not everybody is vulnerable to being bullied or enjoined to participate in this way. They don't need to be, right? Today's autocrat or aspiring autocrat knows that 51% is the new black. Everyone else can keep going about their business thinking that elections are about choice. As for the leader, he construes his obligations as only to those citizens who voted for him. So in these contexts, this means that when the leader talks about our people, he's not merely referring to his supporters. He's referring to a political community nested within the demos proper, defined by participation in a distinct social contract. The contours of this imagined community of supporters are mainly defined not by people's adherence to an ideology, but by their participation in a material exchange. Because leaders like to use nationalist rhetoric, some of these borders in the mind seem to depend on identity, but really they depend on economy. This has probably more to do with a political economy that looks like 19th century Chicago than mid-20th century Europe. And because of this, the virtual boundary around the leader's chosen community is thin as the skin of a potato dug up in June. If there's no quo, there will be no quid. So the current crisis, if indeed you see it as a crisis, it seems to me is not, although it poses a challenge for liberal democracy, it's not a crisis of liberalism, or at least not political liberalism, and it's not a crisis of democracy either. It's a crisis of capitalism.
That's the perfect segue for me, because I wrote in my notes here, while I agree that there is a deep structure of causation behind the current crisis of liberal democracy, I'm really going to talk about the superstructure now. And I believe that it's at the superstructural level that it is important, in the first instance, though not perhaps in the last, to address the problem of populism and democracy. So I wrote a book too, it's called Against Trump, and I feel obliged to Public Seminar, who published this book, to mention it. And Trump looms large in what I'm going to say. Okay, so I want to start with 3 anecdotes. 1, speaking on an April 3rd radio show, days before parliamentary elections, that saw the renewal of his government with an overwhelming majority of legislative seats, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban declared, and I quote, "Approximately 2,000 people are working in Hungary to overthrow the government in the election campaign and replace it with a pro-immigration cabinet favorable to George Soros as well." He went on, "We know exactly by name who these people are and how do they operate in order to turn Hungary into an immigrant country." And then he went on to say that this is why his government had proposed new legislation called the Stop Soros legislation. Shortly after the election, an article was published in a pro-Orban magazine that listed nearly 200 names branded as Soros mercenaries. Many professors working in the CEU, the staff of Amnesty International Hungary, various people working in civil society organizations, opposition politicians, and the staff of independent news outlets were among the people targeted in the articles who were concerned. Orban has indeed targeted for years Central European University, and as we know, Central European University, its main operations have been forced to close and move to Vienna because of that targeting. In April 2018, Orban's Fidesz party won 49% of the vote, which is not a majority, and 133 of 199 parliamentary seats, which is a vast majority. And the further right Jobbik party won 19% of the votes and 26 seats. That's 68% of the vote and 80% of the seats for the far right. That's anecdote 1. And then I'm going to draw some lessons from the anecdotes. Anecdote 2, Moon Township, Pennsylvania, or Washington Township, Michigan, or Phoenix, Arizona, or dozens of other places in so-called red state America, which comprises the vast bulk of the territory of the United States. Over 30,000 people attend a mass rally celebrating the power of the leader who loudly denounces the liberal media, inciting and sometimes enacting violence against critics or protesters, and calling for the imprisonment of political adversaries, to which the crowd responds, "Lock her up, lock her up." Racist and xenophobic rhetoric is invoked to support Muslim bans, border walls, mass deportations, police brutality, and, taking a page from Filipino dictator Duterte, the death penalty for, if not the summary execution of, suspected drug dealers and gang leaders. Conspiracy-mongering attacks on career civil servants as agents of the deep state, and on journalists and liberal intellectuals as enemies of the people. Stage rituals of obeisance to the leader and orchestrated campaigns of lying and disinformation. Donald Trump has run a permanent, nonstop campaign against his enemies. It began in 2015, if not before, and it continues with a growing fury. His presidency is a campaign against his enemies. Anecdote 3, and this is more brief. And it's a little, I wrote this a couple days ago. We might want to substitute the name, someone else's name for the name Elizabeth Warren, but she tweeted on January 21st in support of a new wealth tax. This is what she said. "The rich and powerful run Washington. Here's one benefit they wrote for themselves. After making a killing from the economy they've rigged, they don't pay taxes on that accumulated wealth. It's a system that's rigged for the top, if I ever saw one. We need structural change. That's why I'm proposing something new, an annual tax on the wealth of the richest Americans. I'm calling it the ultra-millionaire tax, and it applies to that tippy-top 0.1%, those with a net worth of over $50 million. Now, Warren is also often described as a populist, as Bernie Sanders is described as a populist, and as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is described as a populist. And they advance similar, although not the same, redistributive proposals targeted at the very rich. I have some quotes from people saying that to that effect, but you know that that's true, so I don't need to read the quotes. Warren's rhetoric is surely populist. It could even be said that the program she is advancing is a program of left populism. Now, following Claude Lafleur, I'm going to mention some political theorists now, okay? I'm just going to mention them. I won't quote them or anything. They're not materialists. Pierre Rosanvallon, Ernesto Laclau, and Nadia Urbanati, I think that both the political rhetoric of populism and the possibility of political parties and movements centered on this rhetoric are endemic to modern democratic politics, and especially to modern liberal democracy, a very flawed, attenuated, corrupted form of democracy centered on oligarchic mass parties in which the gap between facts and norms is large and always in danger of being magnified or exaggerated. According to Jan Werner Müller, populism is a particular moralistic imagination of politics, a way of perceiving the political world that sets a morally pure and fully unified, but ultimately fictional people against elites who are deemed as corrupt or in some other way morally inferior. Populism arises with the introduction of representative democracy, is its shadow, a moralized form of anti-pluralism. Now, I just want to say a few things about these three anecdotes that I told and how they relate to the relationship between populism, liberal democracy. The discourse of populism, as Muller describes it, and as I think we can see in the language of Orban and in the language of Trump, and less so in the language of Elizabeth Warren, and I want to come back to that in a second, is in powerful tension with core liberal values such as pluralism, fallibilism, and a strong sense of individual rights. And yet, I want to argue against Muller and others who have made a similar argument to his, that all populisms are not the same and they are not all dangerous, or at least are not dangerous in the same way. There is an important rhetorical and thus political difference between the populist discourse of a Warren or Sanders, whether you like what they stand for or not, and the populist discourse of a Trump or an Orban or a Chavez or a Maduro. Both claim to represent the people against elites, but everything about the way they advance this claim is different. Who is being targeted and on what basis? Is the target essentialized and demonized? Is the political opposition conceived as evil or morally debased or a present danger to the people? Is the rhetoric a rhetoric of redistribution or a rhetoric of expulsion, exclusion, or purification? These are different. These differences are important. Authoritarian forms of populism demonize and invoke rhetoric of enemies of the people. They draw heavily on feelings of aggrievement and resentment. They draw a hard and sharp separation between authentic citizens and those that are alien or in league with aliens, like George Soros. They often deploy a military rhetoric. They claim to protect the society from dangerous outsiders. They seek to exclude. They do things that critics like Muller rightly condemn. They threaten important norms and institutions of liberal democracy. Now, I just want to say two things. One is that there are deep sources of the condition that gives rise to these populist movements that are important and need to be addressed. And it's also true that their rhetoric is not everything, but it's also true that their rhetoric is important politically. It mobilizes people and it motivates the activities of these leaders, movements, and parties in power. So let me conclude. There's an important difference between populist rhetoric and populist movements and parties for whom the rhetoric is central and who seek to use power in anti-liberal ways. And by the way, most populists, even in power, are not, they claim to be a majority, but they very rarely rise to power on the basis of a majority. They can then engineer a constitutional system to keep a supermajority, but Hitler didn't have the support of the majority of the German people. That didn't prevent him from coming to power. There's a difference between authoritarian forms of populism that despise or at least threaten democratic norms and practices, and forms of populist mobilization that are undertaken firmly within the basic parameters of liberal democracy. And these differences matter in two ways. Can I finish? You sure? Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm almost done. First, in order to appreciate how and why authoritarian forms of populism endanger liberal democracy, we need to be frank. These populisms are not anti-majoritarian or anti-popular or anti-mobilizational. They are not intrinsically anti-democratic in the very broad meaning attached to democracy as a deeply and essentially contested concept. I completely agree with Jim Miller about this. By the way, the right-wing Swedish party is called the Swedish Democrats. And a lot of these parties, a lot of the far-right parties in Europe call themselves Democrats. And they claim to represent the popular sovereignty of their nations against alien institutions or the EU. These parties are not anti-democratic, but they are anti-liberal, and they center on simplistic and immanentist conceptions of popular will that are dangerous to liberal democracy. To put it in the terms of Bob Dahl, it is less the dimension of inclusion than the dimension of contestation that is placed in jeopardy by them, should they come to power. To put it in the terms of John Donne in his important book, Breaking Democracy's Spell, we must stop thinking that democracy means all that is good or liberatory or free. That is not what democracy means. There are different discourses of democracy. There are different efforts to implement these discourses. Some of them are dangerous and ought to be opposed in the name of liberal democracy. Others are less dangerous. And this is my second point. While all forms of populism are dangerous in some way, there is a respect in which populism, by its very nature, is dangerous, excessive, mobilizational, and transgressive. All forms of populism, including forms of populism that are not authoritarian and that are playing within the rules of the democratic game. And if populism can be the shadow of liberal democracy, it can also be the beacon, or at least the illumination to, or to mix a metaphor, the source of reinvigoration of liberal democracy. And so, again, putting Elizabeth Warren aside, what I want to say is, the question is this: does Trump get reelected in 2020, in which our country can move more towards what we have in Hungary, or as part, I'm not saying all, of the politics of opposing Trumpism means certain forms of left populism? Thank you. Why are people so quiet now?
Hello, everybody. All right. This panel is called Of the People, so I'm going to riff on Of the People. Throughout our history, various self-styled populists have claimed to be of the people, to be serving the little guy, working men and women in opposition to the powerful forces of industry and finance that seek to oppress them. Great numbers of these populists have been wolves in sheep's clothing, con artists, shysters, grifters, fake populists, who claim to champion working people, but in fact are carrying water for the powerful interests, as they used to be called in the South. Pappy O'Daniel of Texas was one such grifter, a baking flour salesman and radio personality who in the 1930s used his celebrity to become governor and then U.S. senator. Closer to our own time, another media celebrity and fake populist named Ronald Reagan rose all the way to the presidency, soon to be followed by Bill Clinton, who was himself a fake populist in many respects. Then there's another kind of populist, the whites-only populist, who claims to be serving working people, but his or her populist brief doesn't extend to people of color, and in fact stands in virulent opposition to the interests of racial minorities. These are populists of the exclusionary majoritarian persuasion, and American history is purely rotten with them, as personified by burners like Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi, Pitchfork Ben Tillman of South Carolina, and George Wallace of Alabama. Sometimes when the stars align just so, we get two for the price of one. The fake populist who's also a whites-only populist, a hybrid vividly embodied by the current occupant of our White House. So why do we fall for this crap over and over? Con artist lore says this: you can't con an honest mark. For a con to work, the mark has to have larceny in his heart. All right, back to Of the People. I'm thinking now about Abraham Lincoln, the man who embedded the phrase government of the people in the national discourse. Lincoln thought as long and deeply as anyone about the American project. He meditated in a profound way his entire life over those crucial words in the Declaration of Independence: all men created equal, all are endowed with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln had a habit of jotting down stray thoughts on scraps of paper and sticking them in his desk. And Jim Miller alluded to this particular statement last night. One of these notes, probably from 1857 or 58, reads, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy." As I would not be a slave. Lincoln is applying a biblical standard here, the standard of the Golden Rule. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others as you'd have them do to you. It's a formulation that implies a capacity for empathy, for exercising the moral imagination. And in the next sentence, he extends this foundational moral principle to the realm of polity. This expresses my idea of democracy. Implicit here is the idea not only that slavery is antithetical to democracy, but that some degree of conscious will of the individual citizen exercising her moral imagination is required for genuine democracy. And then further, whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Lincoln is posing here the existence of gradations and degrees, the idea that there are states of peonage and oppression, short of outright enslavement, that negate the conditions for genuine democracy. The novelist Marilynne Robinson has written, quote, "The margin above that grim old standard of subsistence is the margin of personal freedom," end quote. The personal freedom, in other words, to meaningfully exercise one's rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The numbers show, and we've got these numbers out the wazoo, that a critical mass of the American citizenry is currently living at or below subsistence level, certainly in such numbers and in such conditions as to cast the most serious doubts on any claim we have to authentic democracy. Just this week, my hometown newspaper reported that 42% of working Texans and 50% of my fellow working Dallasites live at or below subsistence level. These are working people. And this is that we aren't in the middle of a depression. This is at a time when there has never been more wealth in Dallas, Texas. There's never been more wealth in the state of Texas. There's never been more wealth in the United States than at any previous time. All right, back to the people, of the people one last time. We, us, ourselves, our fellow citizens. What tools do we have to guide us correctly in making the moral choices that genuine democracy requires? And what instruments do we have to help us discern the sharpers, the con artists, the grifters from the real thing when choosing our leaders? On both counts, thanks to our mighty fantasy industrial complex, the job gets harder every day. What is the fantasy industrial complex? It's the air we breathe, that 24/7 media feed of news, tunes, memes, tweets, TV, movies, sports, celebrities, posts, texts, grams, and all the rest that comes at us through the screens of our lives, the sum of effect of which is to numb us out and dumb us down. It's hard to know what's real anymore, especially there inside the screen where so much of our lives take place. Harder to empathize with our fellow humans. Harder to summon that crucial moral imagination. It's a state of affairs that serves the fake populist agenda quite well. As that great American Steve Bannon, midwife to the presidency of Donald Trump and possible gravedigger of American democracy, said, "Flood the zone with shit." Flood the zone with shit. So the question is, are we doomed to drown in it? Thank you.
Say something. I didn't even know I was supposed to be on this panel, but I was asked to come up. Otherwise, I would have been here on time. I want to first identify very much with something Jeff said, that there are two kinds of populism, at least, and it's important to remember the democratic kind. I do have to share my favorite critique of the other kind of populism, the negative one. Many of you may remember this from Robert Penn Warren. It's advice that Willie gets, hell, make them laugh, make them cry, make them think you're their weak-erring pal, or make them think you're God Almighty, or make them mad, even mad at you. Just stir them up. It doesn't matter how or why, and they'll love you and come back for more. Pitch them in the soft place. Tell them anything, but for sweet Jesus' sake, don't try to improve their minds. And that is one vision of populism and how a populist politician operates. But I think Jeff is absolutely right that if we take that view of populism only in the Unruh Muller sense as an exclusionary vision, I think we miss the small d democratic forms. And I think Americans are less likely to miss them because of our own populist movement, which was admittedly complicated, but broadly democratic and led to democratic reforms. Just a couple other quick points I wanted to make. One is just a hypothesis. The crisis of liberal democracy is a crisis of Christian and social democracy. That if you look at the long post-war period, Christian and social democracy alike softened the rough edges of capitalism. They provided communitarian alternatives to a purely individualistic politics. Christian Democrats were rooted in the church. The social democratic movement was rooted in the labor movement. And that the decline of these movements also reflects a kind of decay in civil society that we need to worry about. And we're not going to exactly replace these movements, and yet they performed a critical function in our politics to create you could say a more moderate politics, but also a greater sense of social fairness and social cohesion. And I think we're going to reinvent something like them. Two other points. Racial backlash and nationalism are rooted in economic travail, and we can't separate one from the other. When my friends Tom and Norm Ornstein and I did our book on Trump, we spent a lot of time looking at every study we could find on the election, and they broke down really in two halves. Every study based on public opinion polls said it was immigration, nationalism, race and racism, and cultural backlash generally. But every study based on geography pointed to Trump's strength in areas of the country that were in trouble. They tended not to be necessarily the areas of highest unemployment, but they tended to be areas with large numbers of jobs at risk in the new economy, high rates of foreclosure. And you saw this in movements. Le Pen's best vote came in working class towns far from the center. The AfD in Germany, they did do well in Bavaria, but they did particularly well in East Germany, which is having economic trouble. I think we have to find a way not to deny the role of race, racism, nationalism, and immigration, but also to acknowledge the economic context. Last point that I think is so often forgotten when we talk about Trump, there is so much emphasis on the white working class that we forget that he depended first and foremost on the votes of conservative Republicans. He got 90% of the Republican vote, 80% of the conservative vote. 59% of college-educated white men voted for Donald Trump, just by the way. And I think this presents a real choice for small d Democratic conservatives. Their choice is whether their primary goal is to defeat their enemies on the left, or, and Bill Kristol is smiling because he knows where I'm going. I'm about to enlist him in this cause. Or they can decide that defeating Trumpism is important to democracy and also to the health of the conservative movement. A few, like Bill, have made their choice, and I honor that choice. Yuval is there in many ways, I think. And I heard before I came in, and again, I was sorry I was late, that Bill said that the liberal model should be John Stuart Mill. I am assuming he's talking about the socialist John Stuart Mill later in his life. And I have a dream today. My dream is that today's anti-Trump conservatives will do in reverse what the neoconservatives did in an earlier time, which is open the way for new alliances, new coalitions, and point out flaws on the right. Bill knows his history better than anyone, and it's the one I hope he lives again moving the other way. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. I wonder if I might not respond a bit to this point and also to this question of the relationship between the material and the ideational in what we're calling populism, which may or may not be populism. The first point I wanted to make, I guess, in response is that a note of caution that we be careful about correlations. People in economic or financial trouble are not naturally racist. They require someone to lead them into that territory. At the same time, we don't know enough about the effect of the discourse of Trump and others like him, because there's an obvious methodological problem here, right? Once these leaders are in power and once they start to impose their institutional agendas and start to intensify the discourse, it becomes very difficult to measure and observe what kinds of effects those discourse is having on people, because they start to answer the questions of those who ask with the right answers as opposed to what they actually think. And so this being a university context, I guess this seems like an appropriate moment to enjoin our students and other researchers to think about ways that we can study how people living in political contexts that are less than fully free start to absorb and integrate and think about these kinds of discourses, right? And Jeffrey made reference to the campaigns against Soros in Hungary. It is true that at different points, the walls of Budapest have been papered with pictures of the laughing Jew, clear iconographic references to mid-20th century fascist propaganda with the face of George Soros. At the same time, sort of ironic detachment is the way that a lot of people were absorbing these images. And so what work are these things actually doing, and what is the relationship to the material? I think we need a research agenda and a method for trying to figure that out.
Could I take that as a friendly amendment just to make the point that you're right, that leadership matters and how people define problems matters. It's also the case that in some of these data hidden is the fact that many of these areas were moving in this direction before Trump came along and before the economic trouble. So I accept that. On the other hand, you know, the example of the Nazis was raised, and I think that you can look at the Nazi movement and say they drew on certain an ideological anti-Semitism that predated the Nazi movement, and that's true, and there was material there to work with, and then Hitler took it to a different place. At the same time, I still don't think you would have had that catastrophe absent the kind of economic trouble that Germany entered into, and the inability of the non-Nazi governments, the earlier governments, to deal with them, their rejection of Keynesianism, which made the economy worse, and so on. So I take your point, and I think it's valid, and I think disentangling these things and trying to figure out how they mesh and how they don't is important, but I still think it's a mistake and I think you agree with this, that it's a mistake to underplay the economic substructure or whatever, or if in Jeff's terms, superstructure, I suppose.
Right, that was the point of my intervention, in fact, I think. So.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to reflect. I'm on this thing that I mentioned about stressing the need to study not only what populists say, but also what they do, and the evidence that we have for the populism of the left. And I'm speaking this like normatively. I will identify myself with the left, but as an historian, I will say, well, I guess the experience that we have with populism in power in the left is that like populists on the right is all about the leader. It's not only about being in opposition mode, but also about the leader being the only one that now that the people have, basically that he has, or he believes that he can replace representation with delegation, he has a mandate, he's the only one that can speak in the name of the people, and now he's in government, he's the only one that can do whatever he wants, because that is supposedly what the people want. And that happened on left and right. I mean, at this very sorry moment, I don't think the left can ignore the very difficult experience of Venezuela, which is, in my view, if populism is a form of authoritarian democracy that actually originally turned from fascism to create something new, Venezuela represented an opposite case. This was a populism, an authoritarian democracy that decided to turn itself to dictatorship. In history, all the options are available and everything can happen, and that is what happened in Venezuela. So we have a dictatorship which is not populist, but it's just a mere dictatorship that is not even, it cannot even speak in the name of a majority because they don't even follow the basic tenets of populism, which is, sort of like clean electoral procedures. Now, the question is that then I would like to make a distinction, my own distinction, between populism on the left and populism on the right. As problematic as Venezuela was, and even taking into account the few moments in which Hugo Chavez himself engaged in anti-Semitism, generally speaking, the notion of the people, or the notion of the populists of the left have of the people, is based on political identification. That is to say, that in Perón's Argentina, you could be Jewish, you could be Native American, you could be whatever you wanted to be, but you had to be Peronist. Now, of course, that will not be the case in Le Pen's France or in Trump's America. You will not have the same legitimacy as an American if you are not from a particular ethnic background. So in populism of the right, they go back to fascism, in fact, in the sense that their notion of the people is an ethnic notion of the people, often even conflating itself with religious attributes. And that is something that you don't see on populism of the left. But I think we on the left, we need to be doing a very self-critical assessment of the experiences of populism in power.
Oh, do I get to say something?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Like, do I get to?
You get to talk.
Will you reckon? Yes.
If you have something more to say.
I guess two things. And so one of them has to do with what I would say is the priority of defending a very fragile liberal democracy in the face of the possibility of very anti-liberal alternatives to it. And from a political point of view, I think, I'm less interested in the kind of political alliances that EJ was alluding to than he is. But I do think that it is true that there are many people across the political spectrum who are very frightened by the direction that this country is taking, and that whatever very important differences are fought out politically, at a certain point, I think a question will arise as to whether or not you are willing to even vote for someone who represents a lot of what you don't like because that person is within the liberal democratic game. I think that's really important. And I do think that if Trump wins in 2020, it would be very scary. But the second point, and so liberal democracy needs to be defended. But I also want to say something about liberalism. In one of Kundera's novels, I think it's The Book of Laughter or Forgetting, but I'm not sure, the first-person narrator talks about his experience of being in a rally and how alienating it is to him to be caught up in that crowd scene. And I identify with that. The liberal part of me identifies with that. I have marched in those crowds. I'm uncomfortable. Why? Because I'm a liberal, because I'm an intellectual, because I'm a Jew. I don't know why. But that discomfort says something about the danger of all forms of populism. You know, in Astra's film, there was the Reverend William Barber, who said very moving things that were very populistic things. There was also footage of people holding signs, and I'm very wary of people holding signs, okay? It's very important that people hold signs, and social progress is made through that process. But it also has a danger of oversimplifying and of catching people up in something that ultimately limits freedom at the same time that it advances freedom. And I think it's important to be mindful of that.
Yeah, and then I want to make 3 points. First is just to underline, this is a nice piece of American exceptionalism, but populism originates in the United States, not in Latin America, as does fundamentalism. And two of the most frightening aspects of contemporary politics are native-born, and I think that's important. The second point is, I want to state simply, I've already said yesterday that democracy, in my view, its core meaning is people power. And therefore, to me, populism is another word for people power. Ranking and speaking of good and bad populism seems to me another way of sorting out results that were arrived at democratically into those one likes and those one dislikes. Therefore, I believe the discourse about populism is hollow at its core, in fact is meaningless, and I suggested it's become our polite way of raising doubts about democracy. In fact, doubts about the demos, and the problem is the demos. And it was implicit in what Ben Fountain said about you need to have a mark in order to get conned. And I'm going to switch now very abruptly to my third point. And it has to do with the New School and this institution. Yesterday, those of us who were here heard Ira Katz-Nelson talk about the first founding of the New School being the founding of a kind of liberal democracy of hope. It was more than that. It was an institution founded to the proposition that Americans and America to become a great liberal democracy had to create citizens who were educated and informed about the social sciences. And they needed expert teachers. It was a group of intellectuals around the New Republic and the New School who believed that it was absolutely essential that a modern liberal democracy create a large administrative state that was staffed up by civil servants who were nonpartisan and who had at their command reliable data and information and had the expertise to make judgments and evaluate that information. The problem, it seems to me, that we face around the globe today is that the crux of the New Republic, New School, 1919 version of liberal democracy is precisely what's under assault by the demos because it's an attack on expertise. It's an attack on rule by distant, unelected bureaucrats. And that the rage against liberalism, now understood in the standard pejorative sense of big government, remote experts, is fueled by a sense of ordinary people that they're disrespected and their views in the raw are not treated with dignity and respect. And it strikes me that we're back at a moment that's similar to that, that Hofstadter was writing about after World War II and McCarthyism, where the anti-intellectualism that is abroad in these movements needs to be addressed directly. And the issue of left versus right melts away to me in terms of the question about what's so hot about this people, this demos, and particularly in a modern world, which the one I inhabit is the one that Ben Fountain describes so eloquently. It's a fantasy industrial complex. As we'll talk about in the next panel, many of the most important issues of state are secret. We are bombarded all the time with disinformation and propaganda. We're constantly being manipulated. And many of us live in a virtual bubble of screen escapism. And to imagine that this demos could ever be handed authority and sovereign power over the complexities of a modern world that's facing such issues as global warming, why don't we just say maybe democracy is not where it's at, kids, and get over it. That to save liberalism, we need to jettison democracy. There's my proposition.
I promise Sophia first, and then I'll put you on, and Teresa and you.
I won't speak for long. But I think I will probably disagree with Jim about experts in the next panel, so I won't say anything about that. But on the question of populism, it's true that there's no populist party till the late 19th century, but populism, I think, actually precedes democracy in its modern form. And I would say it's important, actually, to distinguish and not conflate democracy and populism. I would say that you need populist notions, which emerge as early as late 17th century in England, that both ordinary people can know certain things and have a good instincts for something called politics, but also that politics is a simple enough arena that ordinary people can weigh in on it. That has to precede any notion of the establishment of modern democratic forms as a kind of statecraft. So in some ways, populism is the essential ingredient for modern democracy, but then once modern democracies are up and running, I think populism is generally a threat to it at the same time as it's still anti-authoritarian in some ways, but it suggests that there is a people, usually an indivisible people in some way, which means that it can't be pluralist at the same time. So the populism is important, I think, to disentangle from democracy as sometimes its foundation and sometimes actually its antagonist, whether it's on the right or on the left, simply because it insists upon a people knowing something collectively that's singular rather than generally plural.
Just one thought that I forgot to mention is that, I mean, it's very important to, not to abuse the term populism and to understand exactly what populism is according to the experiences of different people and, of course, the interpretations of many scholars. To the extent that in my view, and this is the only thing I wanted to say, that we should not conflate popular mobilization and popular demands with populism, which is the idea that only one name, the name of the leader, represents the will of the people. So in that sense, I certainly do not think that Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are populists. As far as I know, they are not behaving like them. Of course, I have no clue what they will do in power, but to me, these are basically politicians that are putting out their popular demands rather than populists who claim to speak for those without a voice. That's it.
Hi, just real quick. I'm just keying off of EJ, so I'm going to change the subject just a little bit about, I thought you missed one beat, so I just want to finish it. Yeah, no, you were getting there. And we had talked about the conversation about inequality, where I think we were talking about the inequality of outcomes in terms of economic wealth, material wealth, and also what that meant for political power. And then we started to talk about equality, and we talked about the loss or the hope for equality of access and opportunity. But what I want to commend all of our experts here, and maybe social scientists of the New School, to really start to study is something we haven't talked about, and that's actually downward mobility. So it's wanting something that you had is very different than wanting what other people have or a dream. And I think that what EJ was talking about in your study, and it also corresponds with the study that I did in the Obama-Trump areas, among a certain group, 50 to 64 workers. They vote, and they have this very particular experience, which is downward mobility. Not over a couple of decades. They live in areas where they have lost their pensions, they have lost their unions, they have lost their jobs, their skills, and their children. These are areas that have gotten really older and their children have left. And so without us social scientists and political scientists talking about this downward mobility, we're going to miss, I think, what happened in Weimar, Germany, and also in Argentina, which was severe downward mobility of a certain group of people.
To which I say amen. I think that's right.
So probably from my own comments in the morning that I'm hardly somebody that that fetishizes the people or has a romantic idea of the people, but it's strange for me to have this conversation without also talking about the fact that the condition, certainly in the US, for the rise of Trump and the political position where we are right now is the fundamental failure of elites and institutions. That, in the years before 2016, the country over the preceding 10 to 15 years had a series of rolling crises. The first is the Iraq War and the basic failure of the national security elites in being able to provide, actually factually accurate intelligence. Then you have the financial crisis, the basic failure of the traditional economics elites to be able to provide a basic account of how to organize the global economy that was, a massive failure. Then you have the realities of mass incarceration, which produced 2 years, 2014 to 2016, of urban rebellion in this country, the likes of which we had not seen in 50 years. And throughout all of this, the institutions of liberal democracy were basically incapable of addressing massive social problems. In other words, you have fundamental dysfunction, not just in the legislative branch, and that this dysfunction was, it was in tension with the fact that you had these huge problems, the institutions can't address them, and then you have an election, which I think we should remember is an election won by the candidate that lost the popular vote. So you have a set of institutions that not only are unable to address the basic social problems of the country, but that actually produce power on a generalized scale for what amounts to a racial, economic, and cultural minority. None of that strikes me as a story about a demotic and threatening people. And indeed, the public opinion data that we were also just talking about highlighted that, in fact, the vast majority of people in both parties have relatively inclusive views about race and immigration, actually support, more expansive social provision of basic material resources, and indeed are opposed to various forms of warmongering. So this strikes me to be a problem not of the people, but of a crisis in liberal institutionalism. And the idea that this can then be responded to by just like doubling down on precisely the experts and the institutions that generated the crisis seems to be kind of fantastical. And the only thing it's likely to produce are cycles, precisely like the one that we're in, where you have, Trump is unpopular, Trump might lose, but then you have centrists of both parties, if they reclaim power, enact the same kind of limited imaginative policies, you'll have the same cycle again, and perhaps the next Trump will be worse. But it's not really about a demotic evil.
Yeah. Hear, hear. I agree with that completely. It reminds me a little, I made a few comments yesterday to get Jim Miller's ire, and so he felt he had to give me the same, so I'll rise to the occasion. That founding generation of progressives who established the new school included, as Ira pointed out, John Dewey. And in the best of his books of political theory, The Public and Its Problems, he was responding in part to Walter Lippmann's critique of democracy, which is very similar to the critique that Jim just gave. Lippmann had worked during the Wilson administration for a group called the Inquiry, and they had been charged with drumming up support for the war, for doing what we would call dirty tricks on the enemy. And basically, Lippmann came out of that convinced that it was possible to persuade people through propaganda to do almost anything, because people experience the world through stereotypes, through pictures in their heads, rather than really understanding the way things are. And he suggested that what we need is a class of experts, which I think is similar to what Jim was just suggesting, who could sort through the way things really are and keep this irrational populace from making terrible mistakes. Dewey's response was to say the role of the expert is to provide the information on which basis the people can decide. But that if we're not able to trust the people to make those decisions, then we are not going to have a democracy. We're going to have the sort of inner cliques that Aziz was just, I think, quite correctly charging with the catastrophes of the 21st century. So my argument would be that as Ben suggested, democracy is now and always has been an ethical ideal, as Dewey put it, not just a set of institutions, not just a set of procedures. And unless we recognize that at the heart of that ethical ideal is something like what I call an ethic of reciprocity, what Ben was calling the golden rule, we're bound not to enable democracy to come to fruition. But I think the solution to the problems of democracy are always more democracy, not less democracy. And I think it's been the insulation of elites from the people that has enabled us to go down the path that we've taken so catastrophically for the last 19 years.
I guess, I fully agree with that. I'm not against democracy at all. But I think the reason why we're talking about populism, first of all, these words, all of these words are complicated. They are used to refer to many different types of things. There's populism, there's a populist, there's populist rhetoric, which is maybe not the same as being a populist. How many times do you have to use populist rhetoric to be a populist? Does being a populist mean you're part of something called populism? That sounds like something bigger than, than any speech act. The danger is populism of certain kinds, not the people, not the demos. And yes, it's not a majority, but it claims. And my concern is it does bad things with that claim. And maybe a majority will eventually get behind it. But even if it's not a majority, it's doing bad things.
I think I'm confused, and let me just try to lay it out. I understood the topic of this panel, just to read it, to be demands for purified popular sovereignty and the challenge of exclusionary majoritarianism in modern democracies. I had thought that a key point going all the way back to the constitutional founding was the danger of lodging plenipotentiary power anywhere, including not just a people that was sovereign, but fully effective operationally, right? And the point of constitutionalism, the point of the liberal element in liberal democracy, but also the democratic element in liberal democracy, was to try to use different pieces, of sinful humanity to lean against other pieces of sinful humanity in the name of aggregate decency and overall outcomes, or at the very least, the avoidance of perpetual oppression of one part of society by another part of society. And I don't want to throw around too many recherche references, but it is very hard to reread the Federalist Papers, which I just did, without seeing both a very wintry view of human nature, not just the demotic side of human nature, but also the elite or aristocratic side of human nature, right? It's not as though there's virtue in one place and vice in another. There is vice and virtue everywhere, and the point is somehow to arrange the vice and the virtue to enable us to avoid tyranny, which is the summum malum, I believe, of the way the people who designed at least this Constitution were determined to avoid. And so I don't see why we're even thinking about chucking one part of this complex synthesis in the name of another part of it, when the point is that the synthesis was intended to create internal tensions, whether institutional or otherwise, that would at the very least prevent the worst case outcome. Now, granted there was profound oppression built into the model from the start. We're not arguing that point. The question is, how can you set a dynamic in motion that over time will, one hopes, ameliorate some of the oppression without plunging into another form of tyranny?
I'd just like to, if I could build a little bit on that, because one word that we haven't used, which is an old word, is demagoguery. And listening to you just now speak about this absolutely correctly, the vices and the virtues, and they're spread out to my early liberals that I study in the 19th century, they define demagogues as those who appeal to the worst sides of human nature. So they will appeal to forces like and sentiments like racism, xenophobia, and selfishness. And that's what makes them, they didn't have the word populism, but they had this, this sense that in that sense, mass participation, when driven by a demagogue, is a very, very bad thing. Lincoln was held up as not a demagogue, but as a liberal leader because he spoke to the virtues and lifted up people. He was a moralizing educator. That's how he's described by 19th century liberals in Europe, that here's a great, strong, powerful leader who speaks to the people, who mobilizes them, engages them, but in an uplifting way, not in a demeaning way. That's just something to throw in the mix. I know, sorry, but I think Mark wanted to say something.
Bill Crystal also had his hand up.
Okay, Mark, I think, had his hand up first, and then Bill.
Thanks. I partly am echoing, I think, what Bill said. It seemed like our discussion was moving toward the mode of which do you choose, democracy or liberalism? But it seems to me, again, that the answer is an appropriate balance between the two. I don't see it as an either-or question. And on this issue of are the people good or are the people bad, it seems to me that's something that varies across time and place. You know, obviously, some peoples make different decisions at different times. You know, it's also the case, I think, that there are some kind of popular views, reactions that it's hard to justify. When Duterte became president and went around murdering drug dealers, his popularity rate soared. I mean, Trump never had popularity rates like that. It was 80% and more. I don't know if it's still up there, but I think it's still considerable. It seems to me you can't hold the people blameless, of people of the Philippines, for that. And so again, I think the health of the demos is something, the political health, something that's going to vary. And it's not a need to say they're always right or they're always wrong. And part of what liberalism brings is a certain constraint on the ability of the demos to instantly decide one way or another, make decisions that it itself may rue 6 months or a year later. So,
not to dwell, I think I might have introduced when I joked about how the word demos is being used so much, and I feel like I may have got us off on the wrong track here with excessive talking about the demos and demotic. And incidentally, demotic is not a critical word. Demotic just means popular. You know, the demotic language as opposed to the formal language is the way I think of it. And so it's funny that people take it. It shows how, if I might say, elitist everyone is here, that they think demotic is a critical word. But the word demagogue, I totally agree with this, incidentally, which is way underused. It was an analytical word originally in the Greek thinkers and means literally leader of the people. So it's very nice that everyone wants to be pro-demos and pretend, and I think it is a pretense, honestly, that the solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy. People say that at some abstract level. They don't apply that, I notice, in the institutions they work in often and so forth. But it can't simply be the case. It would be nice if politics were that way. It would be nice if the world were that way. But that, I think, is a very dangerous, honestly, point of view, because it totally elides over the genuine challenges of democratic self-government. which involves dealing with a real people, not an abstract one, a real demos, if you want, who, the Greeks thought, are inclined often to like demagogues. And it's hard to be Lincoln, and it's easier to be a demagogue. And that's what history shows. It hasn't changed in the 20th century. The progressives were wrong, I think, in thinking that somehow in the 20th century we were free of all these old problems that the founders grappled with, say nothing of older political philosophers. And so I think being serious about the challenges of democracy is necessary to vindicate the desire, which I certainly share, of a successful democratic government. The Federalist Papers is very concerned to show that popular government, as they use the term usually, not democratic, popular government or Republican government can be good government. But it's not good government simply because it's popular government.
Ben, and then
Yeah, something came to be in the latter half of the 19th century that the founders of the country had no experience with, and that was industrial capitalism and the marshaling of great pools of capital to create great engines of wealth that by the end of the 19th century benefited a great many to the benefited relative very few to the detriment of a great many. Franklin Roosevelt, by the 1930s, was calling it economic tyranny. And the Constitution speaks to political tyranny. He felt the need for an economic Bill of Rights to counterbalance, to take on, this new force that had grown up in the world like nothing ever seen under the sun. And Martin Luther King, took up that call again for an economic Bill of Rights, and he was shot down in the middle of the Poor People's Campaign. But I think the Federalist Papers, looking at what the founders were thinking, and I think they had a very realistic view of human nature. And yes, pit one group of flawed humans against another group of flawed humans for the purposes of trying to create a just government. But what has come to arise since then is this thing called private government. Corporations, transnational corporations. Again, industrial and post-industrial capitalism. And so I think what many populist movements come out of is real desperation. Great numbers of people being flattened by the forces of capitalism. And so I think, this is something new under the sun that we have to grapple with. And so I'm not sure, Federalist Papers can give us great guidance on many things, but the world has spun a few times since then, and we may need to be thinking in a different way.
So I think we have time for one more comment. Did Yuval, did you want to say something?
Sure. I think in a lot of ways we've gotten to a place where we know less than the Federalist Papers, not more. But even apart from that, it seems to me that the question of who's at fault here and what's broken has to be informed somewhat by what we can fix and what we can change and what we can't. The problem is not that people with power are dangerous or the elites with power are dangerous. The problem, as Bill suggested, is that power is dangerous, and we have a system that's designed to break it up and to divide it and to channel it, a system of institutions, and those institutions are not functional. I think it would be very strange to look at the last 20 years of American politics and say that our elites should have more power. That would just be an odd reaction to the past generation. And yet, at the same time, there is no alternative to elite power. There is no alternative to having an elite in whatever you want to call your system of government. The question is, how is that elite selected? How is that elite held to account? What kind of institutions does it have to operate through? And I think the problem we face now, or at least the problem we can fix, because I don't think that the original sin is a problem we can fix, the problem is a dysfunction of institutions and an inability of people to grasp the roles that the institutions demand of them and expect of them. For me, the problem with Donald Trump, there are many problems with Donald Trump, but the core one is that he is not functioning as the president in our system of government. He's doing something else. He's playing a role in this fantasy industrial complex. Maybe he's doing it well and maybe he's not. I don't know. I'm not a good movie critic. But he's not being president. And we're watching the system fall into dysfunction. And you can say the same thing about members of Congress. They run for Congress to get on television. It's a strange reason to run for Congress. There seem to be easier ways to get on television, but that's how they think, many of them. And it's actually the same kind of dysfunction. I think you find that in a lot of our elite institutions, that people take positions of leadership in order to have prominence in a larger, broader culture war that's not about the institution in which they operate. And that is a failure of elites more than it is a failure of the people. And for us to say that the public wants compromise on immigration but isn't getting it is another way of saying our institutions are failing to serve their purposes, which is to create a functional politics for a divided society. That's what we've always been, it's what we've wanted of them, and they're not doing it. So it seems to me that there is a case here for institutionalism that's not exactly a conservative case or a progressive case or a liberal case. It's a case for understanding our system of government as existing to help a dysfunctional humanity live well together. The problem we have is that kind of problem, and I don't think that that means we can expect a class of experts to govern better than the class of experts that's been governing poorly for the last generation and more.
We need to stop and take a break, but we will revisit many of these issues when our next panel convenes, which is about the role of truth in democracy. One little side note I would say, when I made my devil's advocate comment about having just written a book defending democracy, is that, I'm going back to the New School now, is that one of the answers to this riddle, which the founders of the New School cared very much about, is education. And the question of, it was a fundamental premise of one of my heroes, Condorcet, that there would be universal enlightenment. And one of the real issues we face in terms of what's happened in modern societies is that that kind of dream has come a cropper, and obstacles have arisen that would never have been anticipated by Condorcet or Madison, or dare I say, even John Dewey. And so I think when we reconvene, it's to look at some of these grave structural difficulties that are simultaneously institutional, sociological, and psychological, that form obstacles and challenges, not just to popular opinion, but educated and informed popular opinion. So we'll take a break and reconvene shortly. There will be questions from the audience, I guarantee you.
5 minutes,
yeah.
5 minutes?
5 minutes, whatever.
Are you satisfied that?